So welcome everybody. Since we got the recording started here, I'm gonna just say for those people who not only are here tonight but will be watching it afterwards, we're doing tonight's installment of the class this way virtually because we had a lot of snow today in the area and the roads are kind of icy and snowing up again. So if you're watching this course later in the archives, you'll notice that this is not us in the classroom, but we're doing it this way for that reason. So I'm at home here in my recording studio, and everyone's joining me remotely from their homes and whatnot. So we're going to open with a prayer tonight, and then we'll get into it. Hopefully, you're all able to access the handout and whatnot. I'm hoping that tonight can be a little bit interactive. It's a little bit, weird. In fact, I told my wife as I was coming upstairs here, I said it feels like we're going old school back to the pandemic lockdown days, when we were all in COVID and doing all of our classes this way. So it's kind of crazy to think that's old school, but that's how it feels tonight.
Mhm.
Um, so hopefully this can be as interactive as possible instead of me just talking to a webcam here. But I would like to start with prayer tonight. We'll pray an Our Father. And I'd like to throw in a prayer request for a good friend of mine named Danny, who is actually in the middle of receiving a double transplant for heart and liver.
Oh,
Um, and yeah,
Where'd you go, Greg?
yeah, we lost.
Lost you.
Well, I think he's gonna have to rejoin.
It says he's still on, though. He just lost his voice, though.
No, the video stopped too.
I knew that sweatshirt would do him in.
Ah, maybe somebody needs to call him. I
I,
don't have his number.
I put a thing in the chat.
Uh, okay.
Uh,
hey everybody, I don't know what happened. I lost connectivity, so
Mhm.
I'm just going to give you a fair warning with the snow coming down. We live out in the woods, and it's normally pretty good, but who knows what will happen if it keeps snowing. So if I lose you, I apologize.
Mm.
Um, so let's go ahead tonight. We're going to finish up this second installment where we've been sort of doing some basic apologetics, defending the Christian faith in general. And tonight I want to take on something that's really become just commonplace, especially among what the progressive left in America and really around the world. And you might call it woke, what woke people say, but it's really a strong objection. It's what you're going to get, certainly from in most higher education. If you're on a college campus, you're going to get it, really increasingly in secondary education. You definitely, see it in the corporate world. You see it in what we might call liberal or progressive Protestantism. You see it to some degree, a lesser degree, in some extreme, forms of even the Catholic left. You saw it really strongly in the last year or two in the run up to this election, where we had a lot of the kind of woke progressive left. And this is the sort of screed that says Christianity or Christians are dangerous, or Christianity is a negative force in the world, and it has been a negative in the force in the world for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not forever, because it's basically a white Western European colonialist religion. Okay. How many of you heard this sort of a
Mhm.
Uh-oh. Dang.
Lost him again. He was on a good track there too. How does he know whether he's online or not?
I don't know.
I don't know if he's got a monitor that he can see what's being displayed.
Oh.
Okay, we're back. I'm actually just going to hotspot off my phone because I think there's something going on with the wires coming into the house. So I lost you a little bit there, but you saw this emerging in the last couple of years with this term. Some of you may have seen it, in the last couple of years in our politics, called Christian nationalism. Anybody ever heard this term?
Yep.
Supposedly you have to be really scared because of Christian nationalism, which is again this notion whether they're sort of attacking Columbus Day, they're attacking
Mhm.
missions, they're talking Christian missionary works around the world. And the idea is that, again, that Christianity is a white, Eurocentric, colonialist religion that has gone around the world over the centuries, imposing itself on indigenous cultures, imposing itself on native peoples, and crushing their diversity and their religions. And so we have to be really leery of or even reject Christianity for that reason. And we have to turn to, the indigenous and native religions of the world as the more authentic thing. So that's been a real, I mean, it's a huge thing right now. And I know that whenever I, teach on some of these apologetics, I'm always conscious of the people who are listening, because some of us maybe don't interact with a lot of people outside our what I don't want to say our bubble, but it's kind of a good thing if you associate with other faithful conservative Christians and Catholics, and those are the people that you hang out with, talk with. You don't really interact with people outside that world. You don't read stuff outside that world. You don't watch television or listen to media outside that world. Maybe you're like, who says this kind of stuff? But I got to tell you that it's huge. I mean, this is the standard objection, one of the most powerful objections. Not powerful, I think it's pretty weak, but one of the most popular objections to Christianity that we're going to find around the country, and really even globally. This idea of it as a white colonialist religion. Okay. So there's a couple of, fundamental, and if you look at the handout that I gave you, a couple of fundamental misconceptions to break it down. One is that Christianity is inherently a white Western religion. So it's Eurocentric. That's what they'll always say. It's a Europe.
Mm-mm.
And the second sort of is it has been primarily a tool for imperialism. So this is the
Mm.
powers went out into the Americas and Africa and Asia and everywhere else. and imposed Christianity on the native peoples and colonialism. So you have the charge that Christianity is a colonialist religion to the Native Americans in North America, to the Native Americans in Mexico and Central America, that Christianity was an imposition on the Native Americans and the peoples of South America, that in Africa it's a Western European religion that was used to colonialize people. Um, Same thing with Asia. Um, you know, how many of you remember this old Humphrey Bogart, Audrey Hepburn movie, The African Queen?
Yeah.
Does anybody even remember that movie?
Yep.
Because it's interesting in there, right? So Audrey Hepburn is playing this missionary, kind of straight-laced missionary lady who's in Africa, and Humphrey Bogart is this riverboat captain, and he's sort of a rough and tumble kind of guy. But at first, she's got the little African children, and she's teaching them how to be, and this scene is always used as sort of an example. She's teaching them in order to be Christians to be good little Europeans. So she's showing them like how to set the table and which fork to use and sort of European um, culture and manners. And the idea was is that for native peoples around the world to become Christian, they adopt European culture. They had to dress like Europeans. They had to adopt European manners. They had to listen to European music. They had to use European architecture, languages. And so there is this huge level of sort of people around the world who will say, look, this is what Christian was. It was a European religion imposed on all these other parts of the world and all these other peoples. So part of it is that they'll pull out those examples. They'll talk about how the missionaries, and especially even Catholic missionaries, were always accompanying the colonizers. So let's take the example of Catholic missions to the Americas, right? So you've got whether that's the Cortez going to Mexico or Pizarro going to the Andes with the Incas. You always have the thing, well, they had some, Catholic monks or whatever attached to the expedition that were there to sort of baptize the Indians. But really, sort of the spear point of the expedition, of course, was the soldiers that were there to sort of conquer the Indians and take their gold and overthrow their kingdoms and make them part of New Spain, and tell them that they now are subjects of the Spanish king. Oh, and by the way, to be a subject of the Spanish king, you have to be baptized as a part of the Catholic Church. So when people make this whole charge about Christianity being a colonialist religion, these are the examples that they point to and others. Okay. And I'm going to get into debunking a lot of these, but I want you to understand what the charge is. Columbus comes over here and he, discovers America and brings this, and he brings along some Catholic monks. But the charge is, Columbus is bad because he came and he destroyed the Native American peoples, and he, conquered them and colonized them and enslaved them and all this stuff, and then imposed European Christianity on top of them. And this has just been fed by the media. So this has become such a standard media cliche, even in television and movies. Okay. So how many of you remember a number of years back, like the Kevin Costner movie Dances with Wolves?
Yeah.
Anybody remember this?
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is the whole idea. He comes out at first, and there's been like, I don't know, 40 different, but that basic script of Dances with Wolves has been played out over and over and over in Hollywood because they love this storyline. And the storyline, right, is he comes there and he's part of, the American army, and it's, American culture and American religion, all this kind of European stuff. But then he kind of goes native and he discovers that the natives and the native religion and them worshiping the spirits and this and that's all sort of a superior culture, which the sort of dumb, sort of Eurocentric American colonizers are disregarding and disrespecting. And he has to fight back against that. And he, goes native. And so the media has fed this for 50, 60, 70 years, movies, television, books, right? To the point where this has just become a standard part of our cultural mythology, that Christianity is this colonizing. It comes along with the colonizers. And I don't know how much you pay attention to this stuff, but if you just wander onto the internet, read the newspapers, engage in kind of what's going on out there outside our sort of Catholic bubble, what you find out there is that this idea of the colonizers is a huge thing. That all the peoples of the world have been overwhelmed by the colonizers that come from Europe. They're white. White people are aggressive colonizers and enslavers who come and steal people's land, enslave the people, take their gold and their resources, and then impose Christianity on them as a means of control. And this narrative, I mean, when I was in college in the early 1980s, it granted at a liberal university. I mean, this was just what we were taught. Like that's, I mean, it wasn't like this is a controversial theory. This is just, I was a history major, and this is what we were taught. This is history. That's what Christianity is. It's the religion of the colonizers. And when you have 3, 4 generations of students that have been taught this, 30, 40, 50 years of Hollywood perpetuating it, the progressive left and our politics and everything else perpetuating it, it has just so baked in the cake that when you say, hey, I want to talk about Christianity, the response is, well, that's a European Eurocentric thing. Some other examples that they'll point to, and I'm going to rebut all this, but I want to make sure we understand it. Some other examples that they point to that I think are kind of interesting. All this stuff about the colonizers. But one of the things they'll point to is like, well, European Christianity is this Eurocentric religion because look at the pictures of Jesus, right? So your sort of classic pictures of Jesus in that used to hang on people's walls and stuff is he looks European, right? Your kind of classic picture of Jesus is a guy that, he's got white skin. He looks really European. Some cases he has kind of blue eyes. The famous Robert Powell played him in Jesus of Nazareth, which by the way, I think is the best Jesus movie. If you're ever looking for a movie, despite whatever flaws it has, it's the best Jesus movie is Jesus of Nazareth. It's a 2-part film from the 1980s. But, Robert Powell, who plays Jesus, is like this English-looking guy with blue eyes and long hair. And so what you'll have is people around the world saying, well, look, it's clearly this European religion with this European savior, and the narrative that the European savior, white savior, is going to come around the world and give everybody white religion and get them to turn to the white savior. And it's bred all of this resentment among the progressive left around the world. And then that has fed back into our system and into our culture and into our media and everything else. So if you kind of step outside the conservative, faithful Catholic or conservative, faithful Protestant bubble, and you venture out of it, you're going to run into this all day long. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute. That's sort of what we're fighting against. And then I'm going to try to take that apart and show why that's all wrong. But any questions, comments, thoughts? How many of you have ever run into this sort of thing or seen that?
I've seen it.
But it seems that early in Christian history, especially the apostles, they were going many different places, not just Europe. They were going to Armenia, India, Africa, very many other places. And maybe, I think one of your previous classes was about the French being the birthplace of, the first, what was it? The first nation of Christianity. And so it really took off in Europe and was embraced maybe more so than other places.
Right. That's right. And I'm going to, here in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you why all of those misconceptions that I was outlining are wrong. And that it's not a white European colonialist religion. Mm-hmm. But I just want to make sure that we're all sort of dialed in on what we're talking about here, and just kind of curious, how many of you have ever heard this or run into this or encountered this in maybe not even in your personal life, if you don't deal with people outside your sort of Catholic community. But certainly you must have seen this in television, movies, politics, whatnot.
Yes.
Talk to anybody who's been to a university in the last 20 years, and this is what they're taught. This is just the standard curriculum. So let's, Mark, apropos of that, let's kind of show why this is all wrong. That's the whole point of this tonight is again to sort of rebut this. How to deal with it? And Mark, you're exactly right. So if we look at the history of Christianity, we see that rather than it, Mark, the way you put it is it took off in Europe in many ways. But of course, it's not a European religion because it began where?
Middle East.
In the Middle East, right? Christianity is not, by definition, it's not a European religion. It it comes out of the Middle East. So if we go all the way back to Abraham, right? We go to the Old Testament, and we see that Abraham comes from the land of Ur, the Chaldeans. So this is the lands of Iraq and Iran, and those are the roots. When God tells Abraham or when it's Abram to leave and travel to the land I will show you, the land of Canaan, he's coming out of those regions of Iran and Iraq. Those are the roots of the Christian story that we see in the Old Testament. And then they come to the land of Canaan, which is, of course, what we now sort of know as Israel. People like to call it Palestine, but I could go on a whole other thing here that there never has been a country called Palestine in history. There's never been a nation called Palestine. It comes from the name of the province, part of the Roman province that was basically on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. What we now look at as like Lebanon along the coast of Israel, modern day Israel, there down into Gaza to Egypt, that strip of land. And that was a crossroad of nations. One of the reasons why the Lord in his providence took Abraham there and he began the nation of Israel there is it is literally the crossroad of continents. So you have the continents of Asia and Africa, which intersect right in the southern part of Israel, where the Gaza Strip is, and as you go down to Egypt, and you have the Red Sea there. And then shortly north of that, you have the route up into Central Asia and the route across Asia Minor into Europe. So if you look at, it really was, excluding the Americas, which nobody knew existed at the time, it really was and is the crossroad of the known world. It's the crossroad of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they all intersect there. And so it's always been a place where people groups and nations and races from all around the world were traveling through. When I was, I think about 2 years ago or something, I recorded on the podcast a couple of episodes when I was in Israel. And I remember doing an episode where we were talking about the Sea of Galilee and how interesting it was. How many of you have ever been to Israel and gone to the Sea of Galilee?
I have.
What's interesting about it is, well, so many things that are interesting about it, but one of the things is that there are several routes or highways, major highways that come right past what we now know as the Sea of Galilee. There's one that comes sort of from the east in Syria. There's another one that's coming down the coast from Asia Minor, Lebanon. There's another highway that's going directly south down into Africa, down towards Egypt and Africa. And one of the things that's fascinating about, you can say, well, Peter and Andrew and James and John were just simple fishermen, and they were, but they weren't fishermen in the middle of nowhere. They were living in the Sea of Galilee in the little towns there, Capernaum and whatnot, were kind of these towns on major super highways. So when Peter and Andrew and James and John were pulling their boats out and selling their fish all day long, every day, there would have been tons of traffic going right past through towns like Capernaum. And there would have been everything from people coming down the Silk Road from Central Asia and China, people coming from what we now know as Persia, it was Persia, Iran, people coming from, the Kurds and up into the north and Asia Minor. You have people coming up from Egypt. You have Romans. You have Greeks. You have Arabs, and Peter, James, John, whatever, all day long would have heard all of these languages going past their doors and coming through their town. They're right on super highways. So it's interesting to me, and I explained when I was there when we did those episodes. So look, one of the things that's so fascinating is, when Jesus picks these 12 guys there along the Sea of Galilee and says, "You're going to be my apostles." There's the world right there. It's literally walking past through the town all the time, and they scattered to the world, and they had those like levels of connection. So the idea that Christianity is a European religion
all the time.
when it was really a Middle Eastern religion rooted in this incredibly diverse part of the world, an incredibly diverse sort of nexus in the world, right away, that's just disproved. In fact, the first time in the Bible, certainly in the New Testament, that we hear about Europe, does anybody know when we first hear about Europe or the gospel or Christianity going to Europe? Anybody remember this story? It's in the book of Acts, and Paul is on his second missionary journey, and he is in like the part of Asia Minor near like Ephesus. So Asia Minor is modern day Turkey, and it's technically part of Asia. And he's there, and what he wants to do, Paul says, is what he wanted to do was to go north from kind of that area up to the Black Sea. And his ambition was to take the gospel and preach up along all of the cities that are around the Black Sea. But it says that in the night, he had a dream of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come and bring us the gospel." So the next morning, Paul got up and crossed over where modern Istanbul is, the Hellespont, into northern Greece, which is Macedonia. And what's interesting about that is that dream called him to take the gospel by stepping over into Macedonia and northern Greece. He took the gospel into Europe for the first time. And so we read about Paul going to Macedonia. The city in Macedonia he went to is Philippi, where we get the letter to the Philippians, establishes a church there. And then he went south to Athens, and then he went over to Corinth. And that's how the gospel initially crosses over into Europe. So again, all of this historical background to say that Christianity's origins are not European, they are Middle Eastern or really cosmopolitan, because they were connected to all the parts of the world from there. That's its birthplace. And then, as Mark pointed out, it spreads out rapidly. So when you look at the 12 apostles, they all go to different directions. So, two or three of the most notable ones in terms of going to some really far out places is you have Timothy, who's not technically one of the apostles, but Timothy goes down to Egypt. You have Thomas, St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas, who goes to, anybody remember where he went? Real far away. Thomas took the gospel to India.
India.
And in fact, there are churches in India, Malabar churches, part of the Catholic Church to this day that are the churches that were sort of founded by St. Thomas the Apostle, who founded the church in India. So the church in India is 2,000 years old, and has been there since then, and has grown up that way. The Syro-Malabar churches, and it's really fascinating to think of Thomas going there. You also have St. Andrew, who went to Britain and went up into northern Britain. So that here's a little fun piece of trivia. Scotland, what's the famous place in Scotland? St. Andrew's University.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And it's St. Andrew's University because the legend is, the holy legend is that the Apostle Andrew, Peter's brother, took the gospel and established the church in northern Britain, which was a Roman colony, and took it up towards the Scottish people. And so to this day, he is the patron saint of Scotland. And if you want to really kind of follow this down a rabbit hole, does anybody remember all the apostles except one were martyred, and they all are martyred in pretty grisly ways. But St. Andrew was crucified on a cross that was different than the typical Roman cross. It was an X,
Mhm.
not this. It was an X, and he was crucified on that kind of a cross. And that cross, if you look at the Scottish flag is the St. Andrew's cross.
Mm.
And then you have St. James, who went to Spain. Um, and that's why, how many of you ever heard of the famous pilgrimage, the Camino de Santiago de Compostela? So
Yep.
this famous pilgrimage that you go from France across Spain, and you end up on the coast, the Atlantic coast of Spain, in a city called Santiago de Compostela, where there's a giant cathedral where the bones of Saint James, the apostle, are interred, his relics. So the point I'm trying to make is that, as Mark pointed out, that very quickly within the lifetime of the apostles, the gospel spread, but it didn't just spread to Europe. It spread to Africa, to India, to the British Isles, to across Central Asia, and it just spread out like a wildfire all around the world. So the idea, once again, that Christianity in its origins was European is just wrong. Now it's true that as Mark pointed out, we did a class a year ago where we talked about France and how the church in France took off from a very early time, and that's because the Roman Empire spread across those places, and the apostles were able to travel throughout the Roman Empire because of the roads and the infrastructure of the Roman Empire gave them the capacity to move everywhere that it was, and it was everywhere. Um, so I'll stop talking. Big historical lecture there, but the point I want to just make is that that Christianity's origin is not European. Comments, questions, thoughts?
True.
So another comment from Mark. So Rome became the central see, I guess, of the Catholic Church with St. Peter.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the way that it would be more Eurocentric
That's true.
than some of the other places. So maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. Excellent point. So despite going all around the world, the headquarters of the Catholic Church was and is in Rome. And people have been talking about this for 2,000 years. You go back to the church fathers 2,000 years ago, they were writing about this. Why is it that Rome is the head? Well, because Peter went there, but why did God send Peter to Rome? Why was it, you acknowledge that Peter was the head of the apostles, but the church is in Rome and centered in Rome because that's where Peter went. So then that just begs the question, why did God send Peter to establish, the leadership of the church in Rome? And the answer is quite simply because Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire, but it was the hub of the network. Has anyone ever heard this expression, all roads lead to Rome?
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay, so what that literally meant, and it's fascinating. I don't have it one handy to throw up on the screen for you to share, but what's really fascinating is if you look at these networks of roads in the Roman Empire and even the networks of the highways in Europe today, they follow this vast sort of hub or spider web of roads that that emanated out from the city of Rome to and from. And I'm talking about across Africa, all of northern Africa into Egypt, again, Asia, Europe, all roads sort of terminated in Rome. So, you know, one reason why God sent Peter there and had it be the headquarters is it was the place from which the known world communicated, information, travel, the ability to send letters and mail and communications and people from all around the world coming and going to the central hub, if you would, the hub of the network. And so one reason why God chose to have Peter establish the church there is for that reason. It wasn't exactly 2000 years ago the kind of world that we have now where we can sit in Zoom and you can be anywhere and Zoom people. It was a physical world of travel and letters and messengers and this. But I think there's another reason that we touched on briefly in the Dante course a few years ago, if you were part of that.
Mhm.
So Dante talks about this when he gets to the third part of the Divine Comedy in Paradiso, when they get up to heaven, because he has one of the Roman emperors in heaven. And so then, Dante, who, if you remember the story, is traveling there and he asks his guide, like, why is a Roman emperor in heaven? And then there's this whole big long passage where he talks about how in some ways, Rome represented, or the pinnacle of the civilization, or the pinnacle of history, was that God brought the world together into this one place or under thing, and it was pagan, but God desired to baptize and transform it so that it could be um, the head of the hub of the Christian empire, or the Christian kingdom. And this was an idea that St. Augustine wrote about, the church fathers wrote about. And if you think about it to this day, one of the things we don't think about this very often, but I do. Um, and that is that the Catholic Church is is what remains of the Roman Empire. It's the Roman Empire baptized, transformed, sanctified, um, and made blessed. So God took this empire that was globe spanning, or spanned the known world at the time, through Peter and Paul and others. He transformed it, he sanctified it, he established it, and he grew it. And what we have today is a very Catholic idea that the things of this world and transforms and sanctifies them for his purpose. First time I remember when I was thinking about, well, I've been thinking of converting to Catholicism for a long time and studying it very intently but I remember when Pope Benedict, well, I remember when John Paul II died and they had Pope Benedict's coronation or inauguration. And then I remember Francis's, and I remember being with some friends watching both of those papal, what's the word, inauguration, coronation, whatever the correct term is, and watching them all come in and do all the things they were doing. And I said to my friend, "Look at that. That's what's left of the Roman Empire. This is the transformation of the Roman Empire into God's instrument, the church. God took it and transformed it that way." And, G.K. Chesterton has a long section about that in Everlasting Man, where he talks about God taking, based on Dante and based on Augustine and everything else, that God took the Roman Empire and, sanctified it, transformed it, grew it up. And that's really what the Catholic Church is today. It is that hub that unites people all around the planet for God's purposes. So yeah, that's a reason why it's there. It had to be somewhere. The church had to be located somewhere. And I think this is one of my issues with not only Protestantism but Eastern Orthodoxy. I've talked before on the podcast about why I respect Eastern Orthodoxy, but I can't. And I have a lot of friends that a lot of people are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, but well, I can't do that. And part of it is because it is distributed in Protestant, even more so, there is no center.
Mhm.
There is no center.
Right.
And there is no head, there is no center. It's just a distributed sort of thing. And that's I think one of the arguments for and graces of the Catholic Church is it is the church grown up into a head, and that had to be somewhere. And in God's providence and God's plan for history, that was Rome. But when we look at that and we look at the Catholic Church and then what happened from that is the Catholic Church is a church that more than any other institution spans every race, tribe, tongue, language, and nation. This is the thing that gets me about the Catholic Church, if you think about it. First of all, it's the oldest institution, contiguous institution on the planet Earth of any kind, not just church. There is no political entity on this planet, no nation, no country, no empire, no city that is 2,000 years old contiguously. There is no corporation. There is no university. There is no institution on this planet has been that is institution on this planet that's as diverse as the Catholic Church. And I don't just mean today, but throughout history, from its beginnings in the first century, and how because it spread throughout and beyond the Roman Empire. It encompassed Asia, Africa, Europe, India, continent. All of these places were folded into it. And then you saw that eventually it reached into China, it reached into Japan, it reached into the Americas. And so when people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Mhm.
my argument is the most diverse, the most equitable, and the most inclusive organization or institution on the planet Earth is the Roman Catholic Church, bar none.
Hmm.
And I've had this argument with non-Christians and non-Catholics, and they go, "Well, that's it, that's it." I go, "Well, name one." "Oh, wait, give me another one." And you can't. It has outlasted every empire, every nation, every political system. It has spanned, there's no time zone on the planet, no place on the planet that the Roman Catholic Church hasn't reached, incorporated, or folded in to itself. It is headquartered in Rome, but it is distributed throughout the world. One of the things, I know I'm on a sidebar here, but since I'm going to go on a rant about the Catholic Church on this, one of the things that's fascinating about the Roman Catholic Church is if you look at an organizational chart, if we were to take a whiteboard and draw a big org chart, it's like this incredibly flat organization. You really don't have 20 layers. Look at the federal government, in the United States. You've got 16, 20 layers, right? I mean, they actually number them, right? They have government employees are GS1, GS2, GS16, GS18, or whatever, right? You have all of these people. You have 16, 18 layers. You can go to, almost any kind of corporation and go, take any major corporation and ask, how many layers are there between the CEO and the guy working on the factory floor? 10, 15, 20, right? Roman Catholic Church, here's how many layers there are. There's the Pope, and then there's the bishops. Now, a few bishops are designated cardinals, have a red hat, which only means that they get to vote in conclaves. They aren't actually like a layer in the organizational chart that controls anything. They're just bishops who have vote conclaves. The organizational chart, and there's archbishops, which just means they're a bishop of a bigger city. The Archbishop of Paris. But he's still just a bishop. So there's about 5,000 bishops in the an order has 5,000 direct reports. And then, you've got each bishop has priests, and then there's us. So, like, remember the thing we're talking about, the layers in the federal government, layers in your corporation? How many layers are between us and the Pope? There's Father Michael, there's Bishop David, and there's the Pope. That's it. There's 3 layers of organizational. So, now I know there's a lot of institutions and organizations in the Catholic Church, but really when you look at the organization, it's flat. It's very distributed. And even though there is a Holy Father in Rome, the Catholic Church is really run by or operates among 5,000 bishops, of which the Pope is just merely the Bishop of Rome, or is the first among the bishops. And so the Catholic Church really is a very diverse organization if you look at the 5,000 bishops that are spread throughout the world. And to Pope Francis's credit, I think he's tried to say, how can we have more non-European bishops serving in key positions? And I don't want to get into his picks because you can say I want to have a non-European bishop, and you can still make good choices, good picks or bad picks. But my point is that one of the things that Pope Francis has talked a lot about is trying to have among the bishops of the world a lot of diversity, because they represent everywhere that the Catholic Church is. So yes, the church is headquartered in Rome, but it really exists among the 5,000 bishops spread throughout the globe. Here's another thing, and that is that I think is interesting when you look at where the Christian world is today. Now, I don't know, again, because I was a Protestant missionary and pastor. So if I go back to the 80s and the 90s, I was living in that world. Excuse me. But there was a time, I remember when I first got into church work in the early 1980s, where there was a real sense in places like West Michigan, not just in West Michigan, but in America, where like we were going to have missionaries and missions was going to Mexico, Central America, South America, Africa, Asia. We had to send missionaries to those places. And that was really baked into us, right? Because we were in America, we were like, the home of Christianity. And then we needed to send it out to all these places that did missionaries, because Christianity lived in America. We were the real, we were the church, and we needed to spread the church to, all these other places. And so I remember, in the 80s, taking kids on mission trips to Mexico, with the premise that in Mexico, it's a pagan land where there's no Christianity, right? And part of that is we discounted the Catholic Church. Where the Catholic Church is didn't matter. There weren't American evangelicalism. And the crazy thing is, time went on, and began to realize that around the world, most of the Christians in the world today are not in America or Europe. Not only are most Christians not in America and Europe, America and Europe is where the church is the weakest, and the church and Christianity is strongest in other parts of the world. I again went through this kind of epiphany in the early 2000s when I started on the road to the Catholicism, because I was going to places like Mexico and Nicaragua and Honduras and Colombia, and I went to Cuba and I went to Ghana and I went to all these places around the world. And I would go there, and my assumption was, well, I'm going to this place where, we're bringing Christianity to them. And it began to dawn on me that there were cathedrals in these places. Some of these places like South America, they're 500-year-old cathedrals, right? And you start to go, wait a minute, what do you mean we're bringing Christianity to places where there have been Christians for 500 years? And 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 in many of those cases, Christianity was stronger in those places. I remember a real a couple of interesting experiences I had. One was being in Nicaragua
What are we saying?
in
Sin? No, we're not saying that. Yet, if it had.
hey, if you're out there, hit the mute button on your mic. Um, but I remember going to Nicaragua and we were going up in the mountains, a mountainous region in Nicaragua, and we were visiting these villages, and they were full of Christian people. There were churches and we prayed with them, and I was just struck by how important, they were living lives that we would have considered deeply, poor. Um, if you've ever never been to those places, one of the things that'll strike you when you go there is there's people that we technically think of as poor, but you go there and they may live like their homes are like cinder block villages or whatever, but the kids go to Christian schools. And the thing that struck me the first time I went to a jungle in the mountains of Central America, and I watched the children going to their Christian school or to their Catholic school, and all the little kids were in uniforms, and their uniforms were spotless, like white pressed, spotless, because it was really important to those parents and to those mothers that their children be sent to the Christian school and that they be dressed appropriately and they be in their uniform. They worked really hard. This mattered to them. And in a lot of ways, it mattered more to them than a lot of our than going to, Catholic school or whatever matters to our kids. It mattered to them. I remember going to Africa, to Ghana, Africa, and being struck by the fact that Ghana, Africa is one of the most Christian countries I've ever been to in my life.
Hmm.
And I remember getting off the plane going, this is the most fervently Christian country. I mean, it makes America look like Sodom and Gomorrah. I, I remember getting off the plane in Ghana. This is, I don't know, 20 years ago. And we land on and they'd had like steps up to the plane. You walk down to the tarmac and then you went out into this terminal. And from the moment you started to get off the plane, there were signs. And from the time that you kind of went into the terminal down those steps to the point where you got to passport control, I counted at least 4 of these giant signs that said, "We are a Christian nation. If you are coming here to engage in prostitution, sex trafficking, pornographic behavior with our children or our women, you will be arrested, without mercy and everything else, you know, and turn around, get it back on the plane." You go, well, of course I wasn't there for that reason, but I'm like, what do you do? Like they were pretty clear about we won't allow it. Now, I've never once in my life gotten an come back into the United States and seen those kinds of warnings against, depravity. So the point I'm trying to make is that for some of us, I think of a certain generation, I include myself in that, where we grew up in the 70s and 80s, we're sort of used to thinking of America as the bright, shiny center of the Christian universe. And that Africa, Asia, Central, South America are mission fields. And the reality is that Christianity right now is stronger in Africa. It's stronger in parts of, Asia and South America than it is here, and certainly stronger than it is in Europe. Look at things like church attendance. If you look at percentage of Catholics that go to mass in Africa, the percentage of Catholics that go to mass is like 90%. It's like maybe 50% in the United States. In Europe, it's like 5 or 10%. So we go on a pilgrimage to Italy or France or whatever, and we're impressed by the beautiful shrines and the beautiful churches, but the churches are empty. Even in our parishes here, we maybe have. I mean, you take and there's nothing unusual about Our Lady of the Lake. It's pretty typical. But you say, okay, we have approximately 4,000, 4,500 members, and maybe we have 1,000 people in mass over the weekend, maybe. if you add up all the masses. So, and that's pretty typical for the American church. But go to Africa, to Catholic churches. It's like 90% of the people are there. They're not going to miss mass. So Christianity has exploded into this at this point. It really is the center. I mean, while the sort of administrative and cultural history of the Catholic Church certainly is in Europe and in Italy, the the majority of the people and practicing people and the fervor of it is outside Europe and America. It really is uh, the future. Honestly, the future of Christianity and probably the future of the Catholic Church really is in Africa. That's where it's exploding in its numbers, and it's fervent, and it's sincere, and it's orthodox, and it's traditional, and it's not going anywhere. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I thought it was interesting, when was it a year or so ago when they came out with blessing the gay 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 blessings, not gay weddings. Remember this? So the Pope said, "Hey, no, we can't. Priests can't perform a wedding for gay people, but the Pope can. But the priest can bless a gay marriage." I mean, try to create this kind of weird distinction that it's not really, we're not really, blessing them as a marriage. We're just blessing them as individuals who are in a it was a really bizarre distinction. But if you recall, all of the bishops of Africa signed a
Rejected
letter
it.
rejecting it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Every single Catholic bishop in Africa signed a letter rejecting that and saying it won't be that will not be implemented. And I remember that the kind of the Catholic left got really mad about that. A lot of the cardinals and those who were surrounded Pope Francis got really mad about that and talked disparagingly about these Africans who, aren't getting with the program. And for them, the program is what's going on in places like Germany, where like 2% of the people go to mass. The only thing that keeps the church in Germany afloat is the tax. I don't know how many of you know about this, but in Germany, if you're a German citizen, on your income tax form, you have to designate where a certain percentage of your income taxes go to maintain churches, because Germany's got all these churches, right? So the federal government in Germany subsidizes religion in Germany. And on your income tax form, you get to designate whether you want that portion of your income taxes go to the Catholic Church, to the Lutheran Church, to whatever. And because of that, the Catholic churches in Germany receive, like, I don't know, this crazy amount of money, $8 billion a year from the German government. And even though nobody in Germany actually goes to mass or participates in the church, they're the richest church in Germany with all of these employees. And you have just churches everywhere with employees, empty churches. And so the thing is, that's one of the reasons why the Germans want to change the rules, because they want to try to woo Germans who are very progressive and woke back into the Catholic Church, because nobody's going. But the truth is that the church is strongest right now globally, outside the United States and Europe. So again, all of this to say the rebuttal that Catholicism or that Christianity is a white Eurocentric religion. What you can say is that for many centuries, Europe and the Catholic Church in Europe sent missionaries around the world. And those missionaries went out and planted on those fields, and those fields, have multiplied 100-fold and borne fruit. You can go back to the initial Jesuits, like Francis Xavier, people who went to places like Japan and launched Catholicism in Japan. Catholicism in Japan was so strong, It was centered in the city of Nagasaki.
Mhm.
And it was called basically the Rome of Nagasaki was called at one point the Rome of Asia. There
Oh,
were hundreds of thousands, millions of Catholics. I mean, half of Japan was Roman Catholic.
huh.
And then there was a kind of a revolution in Japan, and the samurai shoguns rose up and began to persecute the Catholics and put it down. But the center of Christianity in Japan was always in Nagasaki, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why the Catholic Church didn't really has never liked the fact that we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, because first of all, dropping the bomb was bad against, morally, but also we dropped it on the center of Japanese Catholicism. Um, so all of these kinds of things are to say that the argument, again, that Christianity is a white European religion and Catholicism is a white European religion, what we can say is the church grew there and it grew out from there. And that was always really Jesus's plan. If you think about the Great Commission, go into all nations, baptize them, make disciples, teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you. All of the parables of workers being sent out into the fields to plant and grow and spread the harvest. Um, and then when we look in the book of Revelation, like chapter 7, where it says that John says, then at the end, I saw people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation, and that the gospel had spread to the four corners of the world. So there was a time when Christianity and Catholicism matured and grew in Europe and then spread out to the world, which it has now done. And the 21st century church is a global church. Questions, thoughts, comments, anything?
So I spent a little time in Munich,
Yeah,
and I went to a German church, and it was it kind of had a Protestant feel to it, the decorations
yeah,
that and it was maybe 50% full at the mass I went to.
right,
But on
right.
another weekend, I went to another church, and it was a crypt church, and it was very,
Oh,
very ornate and very, traditional. But it really threw me off because 75% of the crowd was African. And
yep,
I didn't realize until you mentioned that just a few minutes ago that, so I guess that's kind of a interesting point of, the African church is more Orthodox, and
yeah,
even practicing in Germany, they're more Orthodox. Kind of funny.
yeah,
Then maybe one other thing you had mentioned earlier, that you had gone as a missionary, a Protestant missionary, and you know that's one thing we kind of know a little bit about here in West Michigan. Certainly, is that a lot of times Catholics aren't perceived as Christians. Um, and so when you went to those places and you said, well, there was Christian influence, well, there was Catholic influence, and not all Protestant missionaries feel that that's a
mhm,
Christian influence, right?
right. Yeah, and I mean, that's actually caused, my own life. That's why I had to make a decision. I mean, I reached a fork in the road where I either had to join the Catholic Church, um, you know, it- because again, to believe that Catholicism was true. But my friends, and I still have a rift. I mean, I spent, you know, the bulk of my career in that world, and my friends and my, my career, my livelihood, my income, everything derived from working in that world and publishing and consulting and missions and a lot of other things that I was doing in that world. And it's caused a real rift. I mean, I have old friends that I've known, from seminary days that we just, you know, they can't grasp, they just can't grasp that, from in their mind, Catholicism isn't Christianity, in the sense that when they go into these places where there are, the Catholic Church has been for 1,000 years, From them, it's an unreached people group, an unreached mission field.
Mhm.
And you go, how can you say that when there are, churches here going back 1,000 years, 1,500 years? You go, well, yeah, but they haven't heard the gospel. You go, what do you mean they haven't heard the gospel? Well, they haven't accepted Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. And they don't have a personal relationship with Jesus. So they have a very, particular narrow understanding of what Christianity is. And it centers around a very particular understanding of the Bible, a very particular understanding of evangelicalism, a very particular understanding of how we're saved by making a personal decision for Jesus, and receiving a personal baptism in Jesus's name, and doing Bible study. And so what they look at is the Catholic Church, and they say, well, you don't make a personal decision for Jesus. You don't have this, personal relationship with him, um, as they define it. You don't have a personal relationship with the Bible. Catholics don't read the Bible and do Bible study. So ergo sum, Catholics aren't Christians. And so what we are here is to give them the gospel. And it's, and again, if you grow up in that, it makes total sense. I've shared before that, I planted a couple of churches as a church planter when I was younger. And I remember the church that we planted near Santa Barbara, California, before we moved to Holland. And I did what I thought I was supposed to do, but I probably had hundreds of Catholics, ex-Catholics, who would come to my church and say, I want to accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. And I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I've gone to the Catholic Church, and I never knew Jesus, and I've never done this, and I've never been saved, and I want to be saved, and I want to be baptized. And, we'd go out to the beach and baptize them because, they were coming and saying, oh, I went to church, Catholic Church my whole life, and I never heard the Bible, and I never heard the gospel, and I never heard about Jesus or never had a personal relationship with Jesus until I start coming to this, contemporary evangelical church. So, and again, it's all centered around sort of an emotional understanding of the gospel and a lot of other things. But yeah, um, I was invited actually a couple of years ago to give a lecture at a college uh, that I used to have a relationship with, a Protestant college, and it was about missions and the history of missions. And they were going to have a series of speakers. And they said, well, we want you to talk about missions um, to Japan and Asia, the history of missions to Japan and Asia. And I was like, okay, great. I'd like to talk about, the Jesuit missions, Francis Xavier, and this and that. And they go, no, no, no. We mean like the missions, the first missionaries there in the early 20th century. And I'm like, but there were missionaries there, 800 years before that. Well, no, I mean the first real missionaries. Um, I actually, earlier in my career, I co-authored 2 books about missions to Muslims in the Middle East. And at the time that I was doing those, I was working with a missions organization. It's the largest Protestant organization doing missions to Muslims in the Middle East. And I helped them with 2 books. And their whole thing is they're going into places like Syria and all that, and spreading Christianity. And then you go, well, but there have been Christian churches in Syria since the Apostle Paul. Well, no, I mean, those are like Catholic or Orthodox or, Maronite, those aren't like, but, we're talking about like bringing, real Christianity, where we bring the Bible and we tell them about accepting Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior and offering them to be baptized again, or, be baptized. And they just don't get it. They don't see, so for them, all of these are mission fields. The thing that's interesting too, just as a flip note on this, is how people in those countries see America now and Europe. So we are used to thinking of them as the mission field. But when I've gone to those places, their churches there are organizing to send missionaries here.
Mhm.
So I remember I was, oh gosh, this was probably 2006 or something. I was in Bogota, Colombia, working with some mega churches, mega evangelical churches. And these were like big churches. Like the one in Bogota had close to 40 or 50,000 people a week
Oh my.
in worship. They had bought an old Volvo factory and converted it into a stadium. And they had like it was a stadium, like a basketball arena type thing that seated 15,000, and they filled it four times like Saturday night and three times on Sunday. And I was there doing some consulting with them, and they gave me a tour of their offices, and they were spread out into all these buildings in central Bogota, and they had 400 or 500 staff people on staff. And one of the things that they did is they had 100 missionaries. Okay, this is in Bogota, Colombia. They had 100 missionaries operating in the United States. So in their mind, they were sending out missionaries to here because they're looking at America and they're like, look at this godless country. You know, and this is back like in 2007, maybe 2008. Look at this godless country, you know, because, you know, now, I mean, I don't know what they'd say now after all the drag queen story hour, but everything else. But, you know, they're looking at this like this is a godless country. We need to send missionaries. Now, this was a evangelical Protestant church. But the point I'm trying to make is the global church in those places, that in a lot of ways, that is right, you know, for the 21st century, that is where Christianity is growing and it's strongest. And what we have in, you know, Western Europe is the home of these historical places. So we can go to Western Europe and we can go see this shrine and we can go see where this saint lived and we can go see this basilica or this beautiful Gothic cathedral that was built, you know, 1,000 years ago. But nobody goes to it. Like nobody actually goes to mass there. You know, and nobody participates and nobody believes, and they're all dying anyway because the birth rate in Europe, the replacement is all way below the replacement rate. So their population is collapsing, and the only way that they can maintain their social services and their tax base is they're just importing
Muslims.
Muslims. And so, you know, England, Germany, France, to a lesser degree, Italy, is on a trajectory that Christianity will be a minority religion by the end of this century. And you're going to have all of these beautiful buildings, but they're empty. United States, jury is still out. I mean, we have some very strong, passionate, you know, faithful Christians here, but, you know, as a percentage of the population, if you look at the Catholic Church in America, there's a lot of strengths, but also, you know, we look at the demographics and where it's going and participation rates and everything else. You know, we're having more funerals than baptisms. So whereas, you know, you can go to, heck, you know, even at Our Lady of the Lake, when we hear the stories about Father Effner in Haiti, and we hear about the people, you know, walking, you know, 2 hours or whatever to come to mass, you know, we don't do that. And so what you find is, and Christianity has always thrived among the poor. And I think that one of the things that you find is that prosperity in advanced, prosperous societies, the faith wanes because people don't need God. When I've not lived in those places, when I visit all those places, I mean, I've been to Cuba like 8 times or something, driven all over, been all over Cuba and stayed in people's homes, stayed in the homes of Christian dissidents and stuff like that. But one of the things when you go and you meet poor people, poor Christians around the world, Nicaragua, Cuba, Africa, whatever. And then Jesus talks a lot about the poor, right? That, you know, we think in long terms, you know, we sit and we think about, well, you know, what's my retirement portfolio going to be in 25 years? You know, how am I going to afford my second home, you know, in Florida or whatever. We think of long trajectory arcs about how we're going to do things. The poor try to figure out tomorrow. You, you know, they kind of live in day to day, and they're not encumbered by a lot of that, which becomes a distraction. You know, I mean, these are all Jesus's parables, and they wake up every day and they try to figure out how to hold themselves together and how to keep their family together and how to keep their kids fed and this and that. And there's a dependence on God that you lose when you become wealthy, and you become wealthy, and then our wealthy societies with all of our entertainment and noise and distraction. You know, I'm getting kind of far afield here, but I mean, we talk about this all the time with youth ministry. You know, why is it so hard to get the high school ministry growing? Because how are you going to get kids? There's nothing you can offer high school kids today that's not way more exciting out in the world, right? Like come to youth group and you know, there's so many distractions, or so many temptations, so many things that compete for their attention. And when you go up into the mountains in Nicaragua or whatever, and you see a village and there's a village church and there's a Catholic school or a Christian school, and you know, mom gets up in the morning and literally puts a hot iron, you know, by the stove to warm it up and presses their uniforms, and they walk to school so where they can, you know, learn Bible verses and do these things. I mean, there's just a closeness to God that we lack. And and so really when the 21st century, um it'll be really interesting if the next pope is an African, or one of the next popes is an African. I personally hope there's a couple of African bishops or cardinals who I would love to see,
Mhm.
I would love to see, you know, pope. So wouldn't that be something if we saw that? But we probably will in our lifetime see
Good.
an African
Good.
pope. So, you know, I think the two charges here that maybe kind of stick, maybe there's three, and I'll kind of move into these, you know, as we kind of wind down the time. Of all the things I said at the beginning that I think the misconceptions, the ones that I think have the most stick, um, there's still, you can still I think swat them down, but one is the art, right? So the depictions of Jesus, you know, and Christian art or Catholic art is European. You go, well, what would you want it to be? I mean, that's, you know, for a couple of thousand years, people painted paintings, and they painted paintings that, you know, made sense to them. That's why I think that when you see representations of Our Lady, of the Blessed Virgin Mary, uh, you know, in Asia where she looks kind of Asian, or well, the best example of this is
Our Lady Guadalupe.
Our Lady of Guadalupe. Yeah, the Tilma of Saint Juan Diego, right? I mean, she looks like an Aztec girl, you know, in her features. Okay, sure. Our Lady presents herself within the context of a culture. Oh, was it Our Lady of Akita in Japan?
Mhm.
Um, and so, you know, that's fine. I mean, you know, I'm not gonna. So, you know, medieval artists who painted Jesus to look like people that they knew. That, I mean, because what else are they going to paint him to be? They weren't going to paint him to look like Chinese people because they didn't know any Chinese people. But I, you know, that one is easier for me to solve, and I think there's some really beautiful Catholic art around the world that is contextualized to their cultures. I think there's some very beautiful stuff out there. Um, I think another sticking point, where people can make a little bit of an argument, is the colonization thing, because it is true that when Cortez conquered the Aztecs, you know, he conquered the Aztecs and he took their gold, and he established the rule of the King of Spain there, and it was, you know, an army. Um, it was an army, and the army had along some missionaries, but that's true. And I think that's a whole long thing to think about. in terms of, and I would distinguish between certain things that were part of political expansion. It's true. The King of Spain, the Spanish, the French, the British, the European powers did try to expand their empires. That's true. Undoubtedly true. And they, in many cases, extended their empires, with an army. Um, that doesn't mean that the Pope or Christianity or the Catholic Church went out and conquered people with an army. A lot of times it was the other way around. They followed the army. The army went in and took things, the English, the French, the Portuguese, whatever, and the church came along to baptize the Indians in its wake. But but I don't think you can point to instances in history where the Pope sent out conquering armies of Catholics to convert people at the point of the sword. I think that's a myth. If you're into movies, a really good movie to see about this, probably I think it's fantastic, a fantastic film. We reviewed it on the podcast and book club. Is The Mission with Robert De Niro. Um, it's a movie from the 1980s, but it's just one of the best movies that you can see, and it's about the Portuguese missions in Brazil, and it's about how the crown tried to conquer and enslave the natives, and that the Catholic missionaries, in these cases, they were Jesuits, were trying to build really authentic missions to the Indians and in the end, with a mission that they built in the jungle, in the Amazon jungle, gets overrun by the army. But I think it showed the kind of conflict between the missionaries who were trying to convert and spread, the faith, and the army that was there sort of trying to, take land and advance, the interests of the secular government. And I think that's always been a conflict. I always also think too that another thing that's really interesting and fascinating is the case of Ireland, because Ireland is the one country that was evangelized and converted with no soldiers, right? I mean, St. Patrick just went to Ireland and preached the gospel and converted a nation without an army. And I think always that's a fantastic example of Catholic missions. And I would also to say to some degree some of what the Jesuits did in Japan, the same thing, where I think they came in and they created massive evangelization and missions without that kind of colonization. So I've been doing a lot of talking here, but questions and comments and thoughts.
Yeah, there's quite a history in this area, Michigan and Canada, with regards to the Jesuits. Pierre Marquette being one of the missionaries that went through this whole area to evangelize the Indians to bring the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was probably 4 years ago when we were doing during the lockdown, when we were doing these things on Zoom, the One Whirling Adventure things, and we talked a lot about that, and maybe we'll do some podcast episodes about it. But yeah, about the conversion or the Catholic missionaries in the Americas. Because if you look at the Catholic missionaries in the Americas, so say whether that was the Franciscans in the Southwest, the Franciscans who like the California Mission Trail with Father Junipero Serra,
Yep.
or you look at the Jesuit missions along the Great Lakes, like you say, Father Marquette.
Yep.
The Jesuits were fascinating because they literally just went on canoes. I mean, Father Marquette, Père Marquette, and those guys, I mean, they had no army, they had no colonization. They
No.
just literally got in canoes and went across the Great Lakes. You've all been, I'm sure, to Mackinac Island. One of the things that's really cool on Mackinac Island, when you go there, there's the fort, And if you're down eating fudge or whatever in the main town, you're going to kind of walk up the little hill to the fort. Right at the base of that hill, there's a replica of the like wigwam church that the
Yep.
Jesuits were in. And you kind of go in there they've got like, mannequins or whatever set up in there like they're doing mass with the Indians. And
Mhm.
you think about it, and then like for 3 years, you think how cold it was. You're just sitting on that island. There was no Grand Hotel. There was no fudge shops. There was no nothing. It was just like, it was just a cold, cold place with mosquitoes in the summer and, 8 feet of snow in the winter. But those Jesuits just sat in those places and shared the gospel and held mass for the Indians. And then they hopscotched across the lakes. So if you look how they went from Mackinac Island and then they went over to Marquette and they went here and there and they just kind of hopscotched their way across. And then they went down to what's now the Chicago. I mean, they went down to the headwaters of the Mississippi and then
Yep.
all the way down and then up through the Ohio River Valley. I mean, there was no colonization. Now, that was all became technically New France.
Mhm.
That was the Kingdom of New France. But the French government really had no real control, and they never sent soldiers with them. There were fur traders. There were some French traders who went along with them to trade furs with the Indians. But that's a case of Catholic missions that were completely non-colonistic. So yeah, absolutely.
So the other comment about that is that the Indian tribes very much feared other tribes and
Yep.
warned the Jesuit missionaries not to go. They're going to kill you.
Yep.
Well, Marquette went anyway, and he made
Absolutely.
great friends. I mean, they respected him greatly. They loved him really.
Yeah, they did.
Yep.
And that's just an untold story. So absolutely.
So, yep.
So I guess to sort of summarize this to kind of wrap up tonight, again, there's this sort of narrative out there that Christianity is this white colonizer religion, but it's not true in history. It's not true in practice. It's not true where we are. Um, and the examples that they give, a lot of times those examples are out of context. There are some contexts, like I said, when you can point to Cortez or Pizarro, with the Incas or whatever and stealing the gold. But, I think you have a hard argument to make that the Catholic Church tried to steal, the Inca gold versus the King of Spain trying to steal the Inca gold. And those are two different things.
Mhm.
And so now, to be fair, a bunch of the Aztec gold and Inca gold ended up in St. Peter's Basilica because it was contemporary with that. So a lot of that gold that came to the Spanish crown ended up in those coffers. But that's really more of a function of the politics of the day, and as much as the King of Spain was supporting. It's not the case of the Catholic Church going and sending people to steal the Aztec gold as much as the King of Spain got rich and then he donated some of his riches um, to build churches and whatnot. All right. So, any other questions or comments? But I really appreciate you all being flexible enough to join me tonight, this way. It was about about midday, it was like I saw the snow coming down and I just thought, we should probably make this call. So, but I really appreciate you sticking with us, being flexible to come out this way tonight. I appreciate you guys sticking with the last 4 weeks of the class. We're going to take a break. The third session of this class, which starts up, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but starts up here in a couple of months. We're going to take on specifically defending Catholicism. So, like I said, we started off by talking about religion in general. We've talked about Christianity in general, but we're going to take on defending Catholicism specifically against anti-Catholic propaganda. So we'll talk about that for the last 4 weeks of this course. But in the meantime, I encourage you to have a wonderful Advent, to enjoy Christmas. If you're starving and hungry for content, please listen to the podcast and support that. We just every day we continue to get more and more emails from young people all around the country and all around the world who are coming to faith, and that's been a real resource for them. So
Good.
encourage you to take part in that as well. So God bless, and thanks for all of your support. Please keep my friend Danny in his prayers as he's laying there in Nashville with a chest open for the last 72 hours, and praying that his heart and kidney transplant takes place is successful. So God bless you all. And let me know if there's anything that I can do for you, and we'll see you at Mass.
Thanks. Merry Christmas.
Thank you,
Merry
Greg.
Christmas,
Well
y'all.
done.
God bless.
Greg.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good night.
Yep,
Yeah.
bye.
Thank you.